think about a man that lived in a country where it was legal to have more than one wife, and he had 700. In addition to the 700 women that he married, there were another 300 women that were considered to be concubines. In that culture, she was like a wife, but didn't have all of the same exact privileges as a wife, but it wasn't just like she was some prostitute that walked in off the street. So there was some power there. So this man had 1,000 women, 700 wives, 300 concubines. And out of all those people, can you imagine what jealousy there could have been in that harem, if we can call something this size a harem, what jealousy there would be between some of those women. Now, a great number of the women that he had married were princesses. As a matter of fact, let me read to you about it just a little bit right now. It's in chapter 11 of 1 Kings. I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 8. Okay? And that's 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. I'm reading from the English Standard Version that I've come to like quite a bit. And if you have any Bible background at all, you already know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a guy that we call King Solomon. He was a son of King David, the most famous king in Israeli history. So let's just read about King Solomon for a minute, and we got a couple of points to make here. It says, beginning of verse 1, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Now, I don't know much about Hebrew, but I had to look that up. What's the word love there? Does it really mean love? And it really does. He says that he loves them. Now, I'm going to show in a minute or two that he did not love all of them in the same way. But it says he loved many foreign women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them. Neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And the verse next says, Solomon clung to these in love. Now, I've already admitted I'm not a Hebrew scholar. As a matter of fact, I'm not much of a scholar in anything. I'm a student. But when you look at these words, it gets fascinating. And I do have the access to the apps and the software and all those kinds of things. And even though I never took Hebrew, and I did take Koine Greek, that's the kind of Greek that the New Testament was written in, I can actually learn a lot, like you can as well, if you're just willing to pay for the right kind of resources to look. And I looked at this thing and it said, okay, clung. This is basically the same Hebrew word that's used in the very beginning of the stories with Adam and Eve, where it said that Adam clung or cleaved, based on which translation you look at, with his wife, and they became one in the sense that they had become one sexually so they can make babies. And so it really is a word that means cling. Like I'm hanging on, I'm not going to let go. It's also a word interestingly used when, if you remember the story of Lot living in Sodom and Gomorrah, those wicked, terrible, evil cities, and some angels taking human form had dropped by to see Abraham, and because they were in human form, they could do what angels do, like eat and sleep and those kinds of things. And when they got over to where Lot lived, or that Sodom and Gomorrah area, which was just so blooming wicked, they were offered hospitality by Lot. And when you remember the story, there was a lot of sex that went on in that city, and it wasn't necessarily one gender against another gender. It was sex with anybody you wanted to have sex with, whatever gender he or she might be. And so today we'd probably call that bisexuality. Probably not a whole lot of heterosexuality, some homosexuality, but nevertheless, the people who lived there saw these angels in the human form that they had taken apparently was pretty good looking. And so they came telling Lot, hey, we want these guys. Bring them out to us. And basically, if you look at the context, basically what they were saying is, they're so handsome, we want to have sex with them. Now, what happens next is a little bit difficult for us to understand because our culture is so dramatically different than the culture they had back then. But one thing you had to do in that culture, in that part of the world back in that day, was to protect your guest, no matter what. It was about honor, which, interestingly, we're going to be talking about some in the coming episodes, just a little bit down the line, a lot about honor. And so because of his honor, he did something that's hard for us to comprehend. He said, I'll give you my daughters. You can take them and have sex with them out here in public. Just don't touch my guests. And when you read that with an American or a Canadian Western mindset, you look at that and go, well, this makes no sense to me whatsoever. But I get to travel the world just a little, at least I have. I don't travel as much now. And I have seen many things in different cultures that I wouldn't do. But I can't look at them and say, you guys are insane, because typically whatever they're doing means something to them that's important. For example, when I was in West Africa once visiting, teaching missionaries about spiritual warfare, I wanted to see some of the villages, and we loaded up in some trucks, and we took out into the what was not any longer jungle. So many plants had been cut down, but it was still woodsy, just not like the jungle you see on television. And we go into one village into which these guys had never been before. And the ladies, when they saw our white faces, put on some coverings for their breasts, because in their culture they go without a top like that. And they see these white faces and they think, okay, we know what their culture is. We'll cover ourselves up. And there was a little girl standing there. I was trying to ask the village chief about that daughter, but he didn't speak the same language I spoke, and vice versa. And so the missionaries were being the people in between interpreting. And I asked how old the little girl was. She was 3, and she had 3 deep scars cut into her shoulder here that had long since healed, but looked like they were pretty deep cuts, and there had been no effort to stitch those wounds back together or glue those wounds back together. In other words, it appeared that whatever resources they hadn't used. And so I inquired about the 3 scars. And the village chief spoke to the missionary and said, oh, that means that she is married to a demon. Really? Mm-hmm. And then as she grows up, any young man that sees that won't try to court her. And that was part of their culture. Now, again, in my way of thinking, in the culture in which I lived, couldn't imagine cutting 3 deep slashes into my daughter's arm, from which she would have a lot of pain and hope that she doesn't get a bad, terrible infection that kills her. I'm using the illustration not to talk about what my point is today, but to say that sometimes other cultures do things that make no sense to us, but in their way of thinking or reasoning, it does. And so when Lot said, take my daughters instead, while that's quite repulsive to me, it made sense to those folks back in that day. And of course, the angels then decided to deliver Lot and his family. And as they start out, they said, okay, we want you to go over to this particular place. And he actually, at that point in his fear, began arguing with them. And he said, I can't go there. And then he uses this same word for clung. He said, they'll cling to me, meaning they're not going to stop. They're going to follow me wherever I go. And because I had this entourage to take with me, not as much as I own by any means, but this entourage to take with me, they're going to cling to me. They're going to catch up to me. They're not going to leave. They're not going to stop. And so when you read that word, that's what it means here. Solomon clung to those in love. So here's a man in love with 1,000 women. Now, you know as well as I do, he cannot be deeply romantically in love with 1,000 different people. It's impossible. As a matter of fact, what I'm thinking is, if I had been in that situation and had 1,000 women, my biggest problem would be remembering their names. I mean, I've only had 3 children, and it was tough enough calling them by the right name. I'd run 2, 3 names. Sometimes I'd even use the dog's name before I finally got to the right kids with the right name. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what if I lived with 1,000 women, having to know all of their names, etc. And probably it would not be socially acceptable if they were wearing name tags. Hello, my name is Alice. That wouldn't work at all. So he loves his women. God told him not to marry them. And you're saying, then why did he? Well, he married them because he was quite different than his father David. Now, King David was a warrior. And when we read about him fighting that giant, Goliath, when David was still just a young teenager. And that wasn't his first battle. when the giant threatened him, hey, you're just this young kid. How dare you come against me? David pointed out that he was a shepherd, and already there had been 2 occasions we had to kill a predator to protect his sheep. One time it was a bear, and the other time it was a lion. In other words, you may only be 15 or 16 years old, boy, but you, with your club, have killed 2 primary predators? Oh, interesting if you're thinking, oh, that's just another example of the Bible not being accurate because there are no lions in that part of the world. Interestingly, I was in Israel 2-3 years ago, just before the pandemic, and discovered that some of their archaeology shows that there were lions in that part of the world back in those days. And so he's a tough dude. He's a warrior. And he has had many, many battles. On one occasion, he had to go out and kill 200 of the bad guys and circumcise them and bring back their foreskins so that he could marry who he wanted to marry. So he goes out and kills 200 men. Now, he's a tough guy. So he had a lot of wars. He was himself in those battles. Solomon is the son now that becomes king when David finally dies. Probably how we'd say it today is, well, this man was a lover, not a fighter. And so what he did was, rather than being able to defend himself and Israel from all these nations around them, he just decided to marry the daughters of the rulers. And so I'll keep reading then. It says, okay, I started off with King Solomon loved many foreign women, and then read you the passage where God was unhappy with that because he told him not to marry those women. He had 700 wives who were princesses. By the way, just stop and think about that. My day job is working with marriages and work primarily with marriages in trouble, and seeing how that sometimes men can think that they're Prince Charming and everything about them is perfect, and sometimes there are women who think they're Cinderella and that they're perfect. If you were actually living with 700 actual princesses, well, let's just hope the culture was dramatically different back then than now, because that doesn't sound like a good thing to me. And in addition to the 700 princesses, 300 concubines. Again, they were kind of like wives, just didn't have all the full power and benefits of being a wife. When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord. Solomon built, I'm not going to read all these things through here, but he starts building various kinds of idols to various kinds of false gods. And the reason that he's building to different false gods and different idols is because these women he has married from these different parts of the world, these princesses, have come from different kinds of religions, following and serving false gods. And so anytime any of them, if you go and read that passage, it says, and he did this for all of his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. And so his heart left God. And it was because of the women that he had. They say, okay, Dr. Wing, you've spent 13 minutes talking about this. Do you have a point? Yes. And I'm sorry if I have been too boring getting to what the point is. 1,000 women, and there may have been many others who tried to seduce him, but at least 1,000 women. But he was madly in love with only one of them. Just one. And it's interesting that, like in what we just read there in 1 Kings 11, that God makes pretty derogatory statements through his prophets and his writers about these women. God's not happy with them. And yet this one woman that Solomon is madly in love with, she actually becomes the main character in a book in the Old Testament that's in the Old Testament canon. In other words, God had her story put into our Bibles, and as long as the world stands and people read Bibles, they're going to be reading the story of this young lady's love. And so God had it put into his book. So while he was obviously pretty angry with all these other women. That's what he's telling Solomon. I told you they were going to lead you away, and they did lead you away. He doesn't say anything negative about this woman. Now, that story is powerful. As we go through this, you might say, well, Dr. Beam, didn't we look at some of these passages in the last few weeks when you talked about the various sexual things in the book of the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, whichever you prefer to call it? And I'll respond, yes, we did. But now I hope to put it into a different format for you that can be eye-opening. If you've ever been to our YouTube channel, and when I say our, I don't mean the Dr. Joe Show, Marriage Helper International, MH International. My wife and I founded that organization. Our youngest daughter, Kimberly Holmes, runs that organization. We have people working with us who are awesome people, and we have teams now in different parts of the world. As a matter of fact, in a couple of weeks from this time, after I make this video, part of a videography group is going to be going to Kenya to do some things over there, but they'll be meeting up with some of our employees from South Africa. And so people from different parts of the world working with us now are going to start working over there in Kenya a little while to help them out with their marriages there. You say, what's your point? If you've ever then gone to our YouTube channel, which would be youtube.com marriage helper, youtube.com/marriage helper, marriage helper being one word. We have over like 1,200 videos there that you can find. And one of the things we talk about a lot over there is called limerence. Now, I want to show you limerence in the Bible. I want to show you that it's not just the research that we read that shows this, but as with much of the research that we read and we ourselves even do, when we look at this from around the world, and it can come from America, it might come from England, it might come from Japan, that the research we read is not selected just because of the fact that we think it will agree with what we think. We select it because of its scholarship. How many hoops they've jumped through, how well did they do the research, how reasonable are the conclusions they came to. So we don't look for biased research that backs up what we already believe. We look for research to help us understand what's really going on in human beings. And there were some people that for years, beginning back in the 1970s, said that this limerence thing did not exist. Now, if you've not heard of that before, let me explain it very briefly. It's a feeling of being madly in love with another person. And there are some characteristics by which it is identified. In some ways, it feels and looks like romantic love, but it's actually like, well, this is kind of a bad way to say it, but romantic love on steroids, which means it's really not romantic love because it's so much more powerful. This thing called limerence, while it's not considered to be an addiction, is comparable to addiction. While it's not considered to be obsessive compulsive disorder, it has a lot of the same common characteristics to it. But a person who is in that state is so madly in love that he or she typically is not using their best thinking, that they can become so enamored of the other person that becomes the focus of their lives. Now you're saying, is that a bad thing? Well, if it's not causing any difficulties with their lives, in other words, they can still get their work done and things like that, and if it's not destroying some other relationship, you say, well, wait a minute. Solomon had at least 999 other women beside this one, so wasn't destroying his relationship with those 999 people? And if so, then that would make his limerence bad when he had limerence from only one of them. Is that correct? Generally speaking, I would say yes. But in this particular case, I don't think so. You say, are you running for office, Dr. Beam? You're talking out of both sides of your mouth. Let me just say it this way. It's quite apparent that those princesses and those concubines knew that they were coming in for ego, so that he could say, of all the kings in the region, who has 1,000 women besides me? They also knew it was for political reasons, so that where they came from, their dads, who were the kings and the rulers and the powers, wouldn't attack Solomon and wouldn't expect Solomon to attack them. In other words, what I'm saying is, I think almost all of these people surely came into this marriage knowing it was a marriage of convenience and that they might not even see this guy again. I mean, maybe here or there, but I don't think he would even take dinner with 1,000 of them all at the same time. No, he could if he wanted to, and no, I was not there. I'm just saying that they were more politically helpful than anything else. And so, therefore, the relationship he has with this woman is much, much more intense. But I don't think it destroyed any relationships with those other wives because I don't think there was a much of a relationship of any kind with those wives to begin with. We look at limerence this way. If it's between two people who are single, in other words, you're not hurting this person's husband or boyfriend or fiance or whatever, or this person's wife or fiance, all those kinds of things. If they're truly single, and if they're good for each other, what I mean by that is, I'm sure in your lifetime you have seen people and you thought, they're going to get married. They're excited about it. But we know him and we know her and we know how they operate. And we've watched them both for a while. We've known them both for years. This is a train wreck coming. It'll never work out because they can't see the flaws in the other person, and so no bad things are happening. In that sense, limerence can also be bad because it can lead people to make decisions to get into a relationship that is going to be absolutely miserable, but they can't see that. Now, coming back to Solomon, I'm going to assume, based on what I read about her, because she's the main character of this book, I'm going to assume that she's as good a person as she seems to be, based on how this book is written. And I'm going to assume that certainly she had no other husbands, because under the Mosaic law, while Solomon could have several wives, she couldn't have any more husbands. So she doesn't have a boyfriend or husband out there because she'd be killed by now if somebody found out about that. So I don't think they're destroying any relationships based on the political situation that most of his marriages were about. And they seem to be good for each other. Now, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, Dr. Beam. Every time I've ever heard you talk about limerence, which is not really very much on this show, you talk about it a lot more over there in the marriage helper stuff. You always make it sound like it's so bad. That's probably right. I probably do. Because of the fact that nearly every case of limerence that we deal with is destroying an existing relationship. Like this woman's leaving her husband, or that guy's leaving his wife, and children are going to be split up, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even though I'll say it occasionally, people tend to miss it. Between two single people who are not bad for each other, because they'll not say it, if they are bad for each other, then limerence is okay. It's built into nature by God himself. But you have to make sure that you don't get to the point where your emotions control everything, because inevitably you'll make a mistake. Okay, so let me see if in the next 15 minutes I can show you that Solomon was in limerence, that you can actually see it in Scripture. Now, this particular wife is not named. We don't get her name. She's called the Shulamite. And I'm putting a thing up here on the screen that you'll be able to see. It's a bit.ly link. And if you click that link, it'll take you to the Jewish Woman's Archive. And there's an article there by Shauna Block, which is extremely well done, about this Shulamite. So let me just read a very short quote from that. The Shulamite, and by the way, she said that's from a Hebrew word, actually two Hebrew words, that when you put them together, it means a woman of Jerusalem. And so she's the central figure of the Song of Solomon as the embodiment of erotic pleasure, innocent and savored for its own sake. In the Shulamite, indeed, we find one of the most unqualified celebrations of female eroticism in all of Western literature. You say, really? It's a highly sexy book. And the reason that many, many people miss that is because they use language we're not used to. Like he would say to her that her hair was like a flock of goats coming down the mountain. And in our culture, in our time, we'd go, good grief, he just insulted her. But back in his time and in his culture, he was actually giving her a compliment by saying, wow, your hair is wonderful, it's beautiful. And so sometimes people read it and just miss some of the eroticism that's in that. Now, because limerence is this state of being madly in love, with the other person, and that limerence does have identifiable characteristics, we look at this and say, okay, Dr. Beam, what if I want to know more about limerence before I go through the rest of this particular video? Or maybe I want to know more about limerence after I go through this particular video. Then what I would recommend is that you go to youtube.com/marriage helper. As I said, we have over 1,200 videos there. And look for the ones with the word limerence, Limerence, or the words that madly in love or something like that. So let's look at it. When he talked about her, now you understand in the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, it is poetry that's a little bit out of order because it's introducing us to the passion they feel for each other. So sometimes she is reciting this beautiful poetry about him or about her future with him. Sometimes it's him describing what he feels toward her or what he looks forward to with her. And every once in a while, there's like this little chorus in the background. And they speak up and put some poetry into it. But she does most of the talking, him next, and that chorus just a little bit. Now, listen to how he describes her. I call this captivated. In chapter 4, verse 9, he says, "You have captivated my heart with one glance of your eyes." Now, some people would say, well, is he saying that he fell in love at first sight? He may well be. Is that always a sign of limerence? No. Because sometimes limerence takes a little while to develop. But can it happen that quickly? Yes, we've worked with couples where it's happened that fast. And when that occurs like that, he is attracted to her, she's attracted to him. And typically that first part of attraction has to do with physicality, because it's what you can see or hear or smell or whatever the case might be. And so when he says, the first time she looked at me, my heart was captivated with just one glance that she gave me. Well, did it have a lot of power? That was in chapter 4, verse 9. Later in chapter 6, verse 5, he'll talk about those eyes again. And he says, "Turn away your eyes from me, for they overwhelm me." Anytime she looks at him, his passion for her, his desire to be with her, the intense feelings he feels for her that he's recognizing as a type of love escalate dramatically. They explode. You say, well, couldn't that be true of anybody in romantic love? Mm-hmm. To a degree. But just stay with me as we go through here. He's with her saying that your eyes are the first thing that attracted me. And now anytime you look at me with those eyes, I'm overwhelmed. I actually have to turn and look away. And then he says this about her. And this is in chapter 4 again, back in verse 10. "How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spies?" You see, what's he saying? He's intoxicated with her. You say, no, people get intoxicated from drugs or liquor or whatever. No. Somebody knows exactly what I'm talking about because you experienced it at some point in your life. I have. Where that you get involved with another person to the point where he or she becomes so important to you that that's the person you think about all the time. That's the person you want to be with all the time. And it almost is like being intoxicated because the only thing you want is more of that person. Now, I used to be a pretty heavy drinker back in the mid-1980s and drank a whole lot of alcohol, had to get some help to get out of that particular situation. But I do remember this, that I never got full of alcohol. I got so drunk I couldn't drink any more alcohol, but I always wanted more. Now, this is one of the ways in which we can compare limerence to addiction. He's intoxicated by her. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice? And then he had what we call a halo effect. Now, if you're into psychology, you might want to look at what's called a positive affect. That's right, the word positive, the second word affect, starts with the A, not the E. Now, we have a version of that we use when we teach couples, and we call it the halo effect. So this is part of what in psychology we know as a positive affect. You say, what is it? It's when you look at this person and all you can see is the good. You can't see any flaws. You can't see anything wrong with him. Can't see anything wrong with her. As a matter of fact, you begin to think nobody else can even compare to them. And if somebody tries to tell you something about this person that would and somehow denigrate his or her personality or character or integrity, even appearance, you won't listen to them. It's like, you're wrong. I know this person like nobody else on the planet does, and he or she is not like what you think they are. And if finally they can offer you so much proof that you have to admit that some negative exists, if you're in limerence, you're going to discredit it. Like, well, I know she was like that before, but now she has changed. She's not like that anymore. You see, that kind of thing happened about what Solomon felt for her? Well, you listen. In the very first chapter, in verse 15, I'm just giving, there are a lot more verses there. I'm just hitting some highlights. Talking about her, actually talking to her, he said, behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Did you notice he said it twice, back to back? So, well, why would a guy do that? Well, I never met Solomon personally myself, but based on my studies of psychology and people, I would say that there's one of three things going on here. Either he is so enamored of her that he has to say it twice. You're beautiful. You're just so beautiful. Or it might be that she doesn't believe she is. And so when he says, you're beautiful, she may turn her head, look a little embarrassed, whatever. And it's like, no, you really are. You're beautiful. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, that second one I just gave you is not true of this woman. When you read about how she describes herself throughout this book, she's not being demure. She knows that she's hot. And she talks about how hot she is. So I think what you see here is him just being so overwhelmed with her. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. He just keeps saying it over and over again. You say, well, what about this uniqueness kind of thing? You talked about the halo effect. Okay, in the second chapter of the Song of Songs, in verse 2, here's the way he describes her. As a lily among brambles, so is my love among the young women. He said, what do you mean his love among the young women? This woman, the Shulamite, she is his love among the young women. How does he compare them? He says, they're brambles. Now, I grew up in the country. We call them stickers. If we had city folks visiting, we call them briars. I don't know that any of us ever called them brambles, but we would immediately know what a bramble was if somebody started talking about it. Now, if you say to a person, you, of all the young women here, you're the lily among all the brambles. He's saying there's nobody else like you. Nobody else that can even begin to compare to you. So do you think there might be some halo effect going here? You might be saying, well, maybe she was that gorgeous. Maybe she was the prettiest woman on planet Earth. I guess that's possible. But it would seem more likely to me that this is the intense emotion he's feeling for her, which basically says she is the most beautiful woman on earth, no matter what you or anybody else thinks, because this is what's happening in his head. And he sees her as flawless. In chapter 4, verse 7, he says, you are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you. You know, I've met some extremely attractive people physically, being able to travel around and speak in different places. I have met people that were just simply gorgeous. Females that were gorgeous, males that were gorgeous. Not that I get much attention to get males. That's not my style of doing things. But all of them have flaws. Everybody has flaws. And he says to her, not you. You don't have any. And did he want sex with her? You see, one of the things that happens in limerence is there's this thing called dopamine in your head that goes up and gets stronger and stronger. It's an anticipatory high. What I mean is that if he's thinking about being with her, the closer he gets to where she is, the closer he gets to the event that's going to occur, the higher and higher he gets from that dopamine. When the event is actually taking place, he'll still have a high and it'll still be exciting, but it won't begin to compare to the amount of high he had just before he got there. And that's how this dopamine thing works. And so it gets stronger and stronger. So whenever he thinks about making love to her, he gets so excited just thinking about it. That's the dopamine. And there's another thing that occurs in limerence where that one of our brain chemicals that helps us calm down, helps us stay in control, that kind of stuff, it actually decreases. It's called serotonin. And so the ecstasy drug is going up. The calm yourself down, boy, let's be comfortable and in charge here is going down, which makes passion go crazy. The sex drive, the libido becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. So did he talk about those kinds of things? Did he talk about it? Mm-hmm. In chapter 4, verse 11, I'll just read the last half of the verse. He was talking about it, and he said that honey and milk are under your tongue. Now, if he knows what under her tongue tastes like, and he's telling us that it tastes like honey and milk, which would be a delicacy, you know they had been kissing. You see, French kissing? I don't know that France was around yet, so we'd have to give it some other name. But they're definitely doing this deep tongue-involved kissing. And then a little bit further in chapter 4, actually, you have to go back up a little bit in chapter 4 for this next one. He's talking about her body, and he's talking about how wonderful and pretty and gorgeous she is. I don't have time to read all the things he says, and some of them won't make sense to us so much because they don't fit our culture. When he says your neck is like the Tower of David. In our day and time, a woman would say, my neck is what? But of course, she would have understood he was talking about strength and beauty. And so sometimes we'll kind of miss it when we're through there. But as he talked about her body, here's one thing he says to her. Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, I will go away to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. You see, what does that mean? Well, if you want to go read chapter 4, you can get the idea of the context because he talks about her face, he talks about her neck, he talks about her breasts. And then he starts talking about this. He talks about a part of her that is aromatic. It's an aromatic aroma because myrrh and frankincense are aromas. And that part of her is next to what he, or at least nearby, what he calls a mountain. Now, I don't have time to explain all of that right now. But basically what he's telling her is that he will be coming back to a particular part of her anatomy all night long until the day breathes and the shadows flee. I'm going to keep coming back to that part of your body. He's telling her what he wants to do to her sexually. Now, he's doing it in very, very beautiful language. Now, here I have gone and rambled around and taken more time for this than I can, so I'm going to finish this episode up in the next session. If you have any questions about this, please let us know. If you want to know more about limerence, go to our website at the other business as marriagehelper.com, or go to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/marriagehelper, all one word. And if you want to be ready to talk more about limerence when you come back, you can have a lot of information that you've learned before you come back to that. And I'm going to wind up showing you how it affected this guy so much and this gal so much that God wanted us to know their story thousands of years later. Well, I hope to see you then. Until then, read your Bible.